theoretically, let's say that Hunter Biden is getting money because he can just soak the cash up, and they're basically trying to bribe Biden by giving money to his son. Well, you could be an impeachable person and have somebody try to bribe you by giving money to your son. But if they're sharing bank accounts, that means that firewall's gone.
Joe Biden could become embroiled in the FBI's probe into Hunter's finances. Experts say emails reveal they shared bank accounts, paid each other's bills, and the president may have even funded his son's 2018 drug and prostitution binge. Now, if Hunter Biden is getting money working for an energy company in which he has no business, and he's sharing a bank account with his dad, and a prosecutor is investigating that company, and then his dad comes in and says, fire him, or I'm going to withhold U.S. allotted funding. That is so beyond criminal and corrupt. I am shocked that when Donald Trump catches this on accident and has no idea what it is and says, what's going on here? They impeached him for it. These people are deeply, deeply evil. Look at this. I mean, come on, man. When to quote Joe Biden, how about that? Come on, man.
Come on, man.
Joe Biden is in photos with Hunter and Hunter's associates. And he lied and said, I didn't talk to my son about this stuff. No, I'll tell you what it is. Politico reported this a while back. It's called Biden Inc. That the Biden family fortunes track alongside his political career. When Joe Biden was put in charge of Iraq under Obama, all of a sudden his brother's getting these lucrative contracts for construction in the country. Now you have Hunter Biden working at a company in which everyone knows he has no business working at, no expertise, doesn't speak the language, sharing bank accounts. Joe Biden comes in, gets the prosecutor who's investigating the founder, gets him fired, threatening to withhold funds from the U.S. government he has no right to do beyond abuse of power. And then what do? The media comes out and lies. They get Trump impeached for it. And now here we are with many people in this country still believing Trump was the one who was wrong for trying to get rid of that corruption. Now, truth be told, I don't think Trump is a great detective who was like, I must do what's right and save this country over this. No, I think Trump saw a meme video, a meme that went viral of Joe Biden saying, son of a bitch, guy got fired. And Trump's on the phone. He's like, what was that video about? If you look at the transcript, it's very much Trump bumbling into something. You have to ask yourself, why are so many high-ranking Democrat family members involved in Ukraine and these energy companies? I think it's because the U.S. policy on Ukraine was that it's not just Ukraine, it's Syria, it's the Middle East, it's the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, was we are going to destroy Russia's ability to control natural gas into Europe because gas is too expensive, and we're going to do it by any means necessary. In 2009, It was reported by The Guardian, I believe in 2012, that in 2009, the U.S. government had stated we wanted to invade Syria because Bashar al-Assad was blocking our allies from building a pipeline through Syria and Turkey, specifically because Syria said we are allies with Russia and we won't allow it. Then we ended up with our adversaries, I think it was Iran, saying they could tap the same gas field and run it through Iraq and into Europe and strengthen Russia's gas monopoly. So the U.S. has to do a few things. They need to control Gazprom, which runs through Ukraine, and they need an alternative source of fuel. Surprise, surprise, Syria falls in a civil war. The U.S. starts funding the jihadis. Russia's pissed. Then we start getting these pro-Western, protests. Now, there's a lot of people saying it was a CIA-backed coup. I'm not going that far. I'm saying the West, of course, is playing their influence game. The West doesn't want to pay these prices for gas. Russia doesn't want them to screw around with war and destroying their allies to undercut their energy business. But more importantly, if the U.S. policy on Ukraine was to gain control to reduce the cost of energy for our European allies, it appears that Joe Biden and many other high-profile individuals saw that and said, it's time to wet our beaks a little on this one. Get our family members in there so we can cut a profit while it's all going down.
What is fascinating about this, and what I'm very much enjoying about this, in addition to learning a lot, is right now most of the debate happening in foreign policy circles in the United States is between realists, which is what I was talking about earlier, power, billiard balls, Otto von Bismarck, that kind of thing, realists, right? And liberals, which in an IR context, don't think American liberals, think institution builders, NATO, European Union, WTO, right? Those are the two big fights right now. One of the other schools of foreign policy that's not a big part of the American experience at the moment, and don't freak out when I use this word, but it's Marxist. So Marxist IR theory is that it's not about power, it's not about institutions, it's about money. That you can look at international relations and you can understand them by looking at the ruling class of a country enriching itself. and this is fascinating, Tim, because and I'm not trying to throw any socialist aspersions at you. I'm just saying, like, your heuristic window is more economically motivated. So you've got a very different interpretation of this than most of the other news I've been consuming lately, and I find it very interesting.
Well, I mean, I absolutely look at the ideological backing of a lot of this too. Vladimir Putin very much wants to restore the might of the former Soviet empire. He wants the Russian empire back. He wants that trade union. So very much he's looking at countries like Kazakhstan, for instance, and he's saying, how can I build up my own bloc to compete with NATO? But ultimately, I think a lot of people have a simplistic view on things. You know, I talk to my friends and I ask them, do you think Vladimir Putin is intentionally trying to kill civilians? They'll say yes. And I ask them, why do you think that is? You know, typically people will say it's because he's a bad guy. You know, he wants to show the world how powerful and scary he is, he's evil. And I'm like, isn't that a little naive? You know, I certainly think Vladimir Putin is killing civilians. We have videos of it. And it's ridiculous to think that he's not. But I don't think Vladimir Putin gets up and says, I'm going to kill civilians today. I think he's like, this is a very strategic target for us in Kiev, where Ukrainian forces are using. It is a civilian target. Hit it anyway. I think it's more nuanced. It's things like that.
I think anytime you hear people going, he's mad, that's lazy. Yeah. Right? Like, it's possible, but very unlikely. Generally speaking, when somebody who's previously made rational, if immoral, unethical decisions, which they're not the same thing, you can be rational and unethical a la Darth Vader. When somebody has a track record of doing that, you're like, I don't understand what he's doing. He's probably crazy. That means that your heuristics are probably off, and you need to reassess what their motivations are.
Yeah. It's a complicated world we live in. It's not just oil.
You don't think geopolitics is just black hats versus white hats all the time, all the way down?
That's all
you think
it's
more nuanced than that?
The U.S. government
weird.
can do no wrong.
Yeah.
They've never lied to us. The
mainstream
media
a great
is honest
example
all the
of
time.
that, Tim, is the fact that we only make allies based on liberal democracy. That's why we're such good friends with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
You know, that
Nice
Republican
people.
Democratic government with a Hayekian open market and individual rights.
And we're very anti-fascist, which is, of course, why
extremely.
we're absolutely opposed to the Nazis and the Azov Battalion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and mercenaries. Like, we wouldn't hire, like, Blackwater to do a bunch of dirty work in the Middle East or anything.
Here's what I tell people. I certainly think that for the elites in this country, they view cultural issues as somewhat secondary. Like, I don't think Nancy Pelosi knows or cares all that much about what Gen Z thinks culturally. I think a lot of it is, how can you control systems? Mm-hmm. But, you know, I think, you know, what I tell people is, when it came to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I would tell my friends, do you like it that, you know, you can work in New York at a media company where you write articles about Brad Pitt's junk and get paid $65,000 a year? Like, are you happy with the amount of money you make and the job you have? And they typically are like, well, you know, I probably should make more and stuff. Like, okay. Would you prefer it if you had to, I don't know, shovel coal for $5 an hour? Would that be a better life for you? And they're like, what? No, of course not. I say, okay, let me explain to you why you get to work in New York City, why you get paid $65,000 a year to write articles once a week about Brad Pitt's junk. Doesn't that seem a little wrong to you? Like, something's wrong with this system where you basically do nothing of value, but you're making, what is that, 7 or 8 times what people in Mexico or Brazil make? Isn't that strange? Yeah, it's because of the petrodollar. It's because of U.S. The war machine. It's because the United States, its special interest groups are willing to destroy countries to get cheap fuel and cheap energy. And the petrodollar helps us very much so in that we don't need to rely on exports for a strong currency. We just point guns at people and say, you better use ours.
This is interesting because this is Marxist IR theory. Like Marxist IR theory, there's a subset of it called world systems theory. And the idea in world systems theory is that there's an industrialized core of capitalist countries. There's a semi-periphery of cheap labor, and there's a periphery of subsistence-level resource extraction. And if you're going with world systems theory, then like you look at Vietnam, and you're like, well, Vietnam was about annexing or maintaining Vietnam as part of the American economic supply chain. It didn't have to do with containment theory, right?
Right.
And like how you're interpreting this would fall in line with that.
I'm not surprised. I mean, there's a reason why I went down to Occupy Wall Street and was interested in it. Mm-hmm. I think class-based issues are substantially more important than race or identity-based issues. And one of the problems we have right now in the country is that the left has adopted critical race theory, which it pits people, regular people against each other, poor people against each other. You end up with people like Serena Williams, who is one of the wealthiest people on the planet, most famous and most celebrated, and she's a victim and she's oppressed. And you'll get a homeless white veteran who is an oppressor. Now, that system clearly does not make sense. Class issues matter substantially more than these, ridiculous ideas about privilege. Now, I certainly think racism exists.
Right.
I think the problem with the left is they see things too much at the surface level.
Yeah,
White privilege is not what it is. It's majority privilege. In any country in which you're the majority, you're going to have some benefits because people think, look, and act like you more so than other people, immigrants or strangers. But they just say it's white privilege, which is extremely reductive. When you have someone who's white from South Africa or a white person from Ukraine, from Ukraine, Luke Rudkowski, who's on the show every so often, he's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Polish guy, but according to the critical race theorists, he's a person of color. Absolutely. The coalition of communities of color say that Slavic people are people of color, even if they're white with blonde hair and blue eyes. No joke.
I'm English, Scottish, Clydesdale. I think the 23andMe test was off.
Oh, then you're white.
I'm straight up. I'm just a jar of mayonnaise.
I feel like you can reverse engineer critical race theory to look at it as critical theory to see the class structure ripped away, because what happened is when slavery ended in the United States, a bunch of people were just descendants of slaves, and slaves were dumped onto the streets with no education, no money. So their kids had no education, no money, most of them. Then their kids tend to have low or little education and money. And so we're looking at like the seventh generation now of a lot of those families, irrelevant of the skin color. They just happened to, in this iteration of slavery, come from that area of the world.
Redlining go on as well. So which would be the best way to accumulate multi-generational wealth is home ownership. And that was basically precluded up until 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So
now, and you could argue there is systemic racism in this, but that it is a class system.
Yes, but the economic fallout is the main factor.
I'll also add to introduce more complexity to what we're talking about here. It wasn't necessarily just a straight line of this group of people not gaining wealth through the generations. It's actually the case that prior to the 1960s, there were fewer black out-of-wedlock births than there are today by a significant margin. And we know one of the best ways to prevent poverty is to ensure that you're married before you have children. And so there are things that were done to the black community. Some say the war on drugs, some say the war on poverty. The Brookings Institute has actually said legal abortion is a big part of it, but there are policies that came much later.
I think there are. I think systemic racism is it absolutely exists, but there's an issue of how the left interprets it and what they think it means, and how far and extreme they go with it. So I'll give you an example. You'll talk to one of these critical race theorists about systemic racism, and they'll tell you today, that all police are racist or whatever, and I'm like, okay, you got to stop. Right? Mm-hmm. The average person is substantially less racist, leaning towards not even racist for the most part these days. That's the average person, But they'll tell you the whole system's racist. The way I explain it to people is that in Chicago, easiest example, we had two big problems: blockbusting and redlining. Have you ever heard of these? Redlining, of course, is very famous. It's where you have the red line trains. The real estate companies would isolate certain areas where they would only sell to black people and they wouldn't sell outside, creating these, segregated areas. Blockbusting is one of the dirtiest and most evil things, I've ever heard about. It's where these companies would go to a white neighborhood, buy a house, move a black family in, and then go door to door to all the houses and say, there goes the neighborhood. You better sell to us before it's too late. The people would panic sell at a premium to these companies, who would then kick the black family out and sell the whole neighborhood back to white people for a profit. That was made illegal. Redlining was made illegal, but only in the 80s. Yeah. That means there are people my age today who are just now the first generation getting out of overtly, nowadays, illegal systems that caused damage to people based on their race. Mm-hmm. So what I could say is, yes, obviously today, remnants of that racism still exist in the system. Are individuals racist? Some still are, but for the most part, we've done a lot to change that. The solution, however, is not to go to a poor white person and say, you will not be granted access to this. We will take money from you. That makes no sense. Now that we've changed the laws, the solution is class-based. Because if the left believes that the black community is disproportionately impoverished, then class-based issues will still disproportionately favor them, but it won't leave behind Latinos, Asians, or white people who are also negatively impacted.
I have an ex-girlfriend who, when we were dating, her father lived, I won't say where it is, it's not out her, but her father, if she wanted to call him, she couldn't because he didn't own a phone. She was white, by the way, so was her father. But like if she wanted to get in contact with her dad, she had to call her neighbor and have her neighbor walk over to get her dad because her dad was that poor. And I think that's a good example of I don't really feel like saying he had massive privilege really counts. Like that guy that couldn't afford a phone, I feel like is economically underprivileged. And I'll give you another example of, systemic racism at work in government that's still there. When you look at almost all zoning laws, I am most familiar with Los Angeles. To plug it, I wrote a book called Los Angeles is Hideous, Poems About an Ugly City. So if you don't like L.A. and you like funny stuff, it's a funny book. I'll get your copy, Tim. I'll send
That sounds
it to you.
good.
It's fun book.
I don't like L.A.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just an asphalt carbuncle. But in the process of researching these poems that I wrote about Los Angeles, the reason that Los Angeles is the massive, sprawling city that it is not, it is accidental, but it's not unavoidable. The reason that it's so sprawling is that Los Angeles during the, I guess it'd be the 40s and 50s, basically, like many cities in America, but I'm most familiar with LA, went, oh no, black people are moving in. We should basically outlaw apartment buildings because it was racist. It was overtly racist at the time. And the thinking was, well, if we make people live in homes and houses, white people can afford houses more than black people can. So already there's going to be an advantage there. But the way law is set up in California is that houses in certain neighborhoods have what are called neighborhood covenants, where you own the property, but if you have to sell it, the neighborhood itself has to write off on that. They have to sign off on that, meaning that you have to be a morally upstanding person of our skin color, right? And so that was intentional. So you look at like Los Angeles today, 80% of the real estate in Los Angeles now, you can't have more than one family living in a place. You have to have a house.
Right.
Even though it's like the second biggest, the biggest city in America, you can't build up legally. You can't build up. You have to build out. So it's pancaking.
Do you know the story of St. Louis?
No.
So St. Louis isn't actually one city. It's I think it's 99 plus smaller jurisdictions all cluttered together.
Really?
St. Louis is a city, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but the greater St. Louis area that people refer to is actually a collection of a whole bunch of small cities. And so what happened here was a long time ago in St. Louis, that we ended up with, for a variety of reasons, desegregation comes into play, and there were many white people. And you got to understand that back in the late 50s and 60s, this country was what, like 92, 90 or whatever percent white. So you have these white communities, overtly white, start seeing black families moving into certain areas, and so they decide to start leaving. What they did was they moved outside of the city and created their own communities with covenants like you're only allowed to have 10 houses in this city,
Right.
can't build any more, to make sure no one else could move in.
Yeah.
Long story short, by today, we have 90 plus jurisdictions, each with their own police department. What ends up happening is that many of these areas that are impoverished, and there is a tie between the black community and historical poverty for a variety of reasons like blockbusting and redlining, and we know that home ownership is one of the ways that people transfer wealth, making it very difficult for them. What happens is this system that is not, I wouldn't call, today, I wouldn't say it is racist, but it was created through racist ideas people
what
had.
we would call systemic racism, right? Like it's a great example of like those of us with more like libertarian inclinations can go, great, I don't like regulations.
Right.
And this is a great example of regulations being racist that we can kind of unite out and root them out.
So what ends up happening is, for racial reasons, we end up with all these jurisdictions. Today, and so I went down, I was in Ferguson during the Michael Brown riots, and I worked on a documentary, I produced a documentary about what was going on. There's something they have called going on tour. So what happens is you are in one of these neighborhoods that is predominantly black. You're lower income for a variety of reasons. You have a vehicle and your plate is expired. Now it's $20 to get your plate re-registered, but you're poor. You've got debt. You've got credit cards. So you decide: do I eat? Do I pay gas? Or do I get my plate fixed? You say, well, look, I got to eat. I got to pay my rent. I can hope I don't get pulled over for my plate. You drive so in order to go to work, you're likely going to drive through 2 or 3 different cities because there are these small jurisdictions. We saw this with a ton of people. They would leave their neighborhood, and while they're driving, they get pulled over, and the cop says, your plate's expired, here's your ticket, have a nice day. They start driving again, they get pulled over 10 minutes later, plate's expired in a different jurisdiction, and it keeps happening. Then finally, when they're like, I couldn't pay the $20, I can't pay the $100.
Yeah.
What happens is they'll get arrested, and it'll be like a 2-day thing. You couldn't pay the fine, it's 2 days in jail.
Yeah.
What happens when they get out of jail? The police from the next jurisdiction are waiting for them to take them to the next jail.
And they might have lost their job during that time, too.
And they usually did. Now, a lot of people say, well, they shouldn't be driving with expired plates. Perhaps that's true. For a lot of these people, it's like, yo, I have to drive to get to work. I live in the suburbs. But another issue we saw was people who would get tickets for their headlight going out. And so you're a dude and you're driving, you don't even know your headlight's out. You get pulled over. This is one of the stories we heard. And the guy's like, so I say, okay, I'll go home. I got to drive through 2 or 3 more cities where I get pulled over and end up with 4 tickets, all for this.
Do the people that say like they shouldn't be driving with expired plates, why do we have those? Like I get having a serial number on your car that identifies you own it makes sense to me. You should have that, right? But the little tags, that's just a regressive tax. That's all that
100%.
is. It doesn't do anything. It's like the reason we do that is because poor people are the easiest group of taxpayers to militate against. It's a lot hard. Like, try doing a tax on yoga and see what happens to you. You're not going to get a bunch of upper middle class white people let you do that.
Thanks for checking out this segment from the Timcast IRL podcast. But if you want to check out the full show live, tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. And if you want more special access content, head over to timcast.com and become a member. Your membership helps sustain this company, keep our journalists employed, makes this show happen, and you will get access to exclusive members-only segments of the Timcast IRL podcast, and there's a massive library to check out. So again, go to timcast.com or tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., and we'll see you all there.